Yes, thank you. Welcome, everybody, in a London morning and in the evening or late afternoon in East Asia. In my role as head of departments of the Department of Politics and International Studies at SOAS, the University of London, it's my real honor and pleasure to welcome you to this Korea Global Forum for Peace. I would like to thank in particular my colleagues, Dr. Tatian Kong of SOAS, and Dr. Ramon Pacheco Pardo of King's College for co-hosting this really important event together with the South Korean Ministry of Unification. I think this is an example of really fruitful collaboration between SOAS and King's College, as well as the ministry, and I'm grateful to them for inviting me to offer some opening remarks. Like all of us, I wish we could hold this event in person rather than in cyberspace, yet such are the times we are living in, to the point that it has become rather normal to meet and have conversations online. Unfortunately, this means I have to address you from my flat in London. The COVID-19 pandemic seems to be the defining issue of our lives, at least in Europe, and the last presidential elections in the United States have captured all our attentions, at least momentarily. And yet, the conflicts in this world have not gone away. So tensions on and off the Korean Peninsula remain high, and the question of how to build a peaceful relationship and perhaps overcome the division remains central. It remains one of the crucial questions of our times, and it is a crucial question not only in East Asia, but very much also in Europe. And so I welcome the angle for this forum to look at the European role in this process. So over the next 3 days, experts, scholars, and diplomats from Europe and East Asia will discuss the crucial question of peace building on the prospect of peace on the Korean Peninsula. And as someone who grew up in Germany and who has studied the politics of European security, who has looked very carefully at the concept of friendship and of peace in international relations, I would just like to offer 4 basic thoughts on the way, if you allow me. The first is that peace building takes place at multiple levels, and the geopolitical context is as important as are the decisions of individuals. So to understand and influence how the different levels and spaces interact is one of the greatest challenges. Second, 2 days ago, on the 9th of November, was the 31st anniversary of the opening of the Berlin Wall. Many books have been written about why and how this happened, but I think one of the key lessons to be taken from that event is that it was rather unexpected. How do you plan for the unexpected? Third, it is important to keep in mind that the task of peace building does not conclude with the end of hostilities, by tearing down a wall or by opening borders. Peace building is an ongoing effort that is never done, and its nature and the tasks involved change over time. And finally, we need to think carefully, following from that, what we mean by peace. It is a comforting term, and too often we take its meaning for granted, I believe. Yet, it is important to always be attentive to the fact that 2 people in the same room may not disagree of what they mean by peace. They may have different understandings of peace. If we don't recognize this, we may be talking past each other, and we may not be building the same thing. On that note, I wish you fruitful conversations in the coming days. Welcome again, and thank you.
Good morning and good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. John Montgomery. I'm the head of department here in the Department of European and International Studies at King's College, London, which is part of the University of London as well, working in collaboration with SOAS. I would like, in following that very wonderful intervention by Felix, I would just like to, also reiterate the sincerest gratitude that the department has, that EIS has, for its very fruitful and meaningful relationship with the Korea Foundation, and also kind of delighted to be part of sponsoring this Korean Global Forum for Peace. This is really central to our mission as a department to engage in these meaningful discussions and talks where academic knowledge is applied and new relationships are forged. Today is November 11th in the UK. This is a day of remembrance. So I think it is, really wonderful that this is happening today. That everyone here is brought together across the globe. The great advance of technology allows us to reach across a city and across the globe in order to have these meaningful kind of global discussions, and to have everyone here to discuss peace. And what that means in this time, this turning point. I mean, we are all feel the weight of history and the kind of the way in which world politics is pregnant with possibilities. And as we await, the unfolding of history and with the challenges that face us today, we know that all of you have come together in order to talk about peace as a positive process, as a transformative process, as something that brings an important element of human progress, for us as a human civilization. And I think that that's really meaningful today, and it's a very solemn duty. So I won't keep you any longer, but only to say how much we appreciate all of these efforts, and I hope that they bear fruit in the months and the years to come. Thank you.
This is my turn now. Hello, I'm Anna Park, Ambassador of the Republic of Korea to the United Kingdom and Northern Ireland. I would like to welcome all the distinguished speakers, guests, both domestic and international, who are attending this meaningful online event over the coming days. I'm sure you are in for the fascinating 3 days of discussions. I'd like to express my appreciation to the Korean Global Forum for Peace for hosting today's event alongside the Ministry of Unification of the Republic of Korea, SOAS, School of Oriental and African Studies, and King's College. I'd like to thank the officials, professors, and the staff of these institutions who have made an excellent preparation for today's event. This event is being held as a part of Korean Global Forum for Peace, which has been promoted by the Ministry of Unification since 2010. The main purpose of this event is to attract interest of the international community so that we can work together toward building a common ground on the issue of peace and the unification on the Korean Peninsula. This year marks the 70th anniversary of the outbreak of the Korean War and the 20th anniversary of the June 15 South and North Joint Declaration, and the 30th anniversary of German reunification. This is therefore very symbolic to hold this event in 2020 this year. I understand that the seminars which we participate in deal with the role of Europe in denuclearization of North Korea and peace building on the Korean Peninsula. This is a very important topic because bringing about peace on the Korean Peninsula is of vital interest not only to the region, but also to the world at large. President Moon Jae-in mentioned in his keynote speech at this year's UN General Assembly that peace on the Korean Peninsula is still in the making. He expressed a need for us to pursue a multilateral security architecture so that we can attain denuclearization with the continued support and cooperation of the international community and more systematic mechanism, and in turn bring about lasting peace on the Korean Peninsula and beyond. As permanent member of the UN Security Council, the UK has an important role to play in the denuclearization of North Korea and the establishment of peace on the Korean Peninsula. Currently, the Republic of Korea and the UK are working closely together on the matters concerning the Korean Peninsula, And I hope and I'm sure that the UK will continue to pay close attention to this crucial issue with passion in the future as well. In all, I hope all of you will, including me, will enjoy the 3 days of informative discussions. And I have no doubt we will all go away from this event more convinced about the necessity of building peace on the Korean Peninsula and the role of the UK and Europe in realizing it. Thank you.
Good afternoon to those who are joining this event from other parts of the world. I'm Simon Smith, the British Ambassador to South Korea, and I'd like to extend my congratulations to the Ministry of Unification, to SOAS and to King's College London on your success in holding this conference on the role for European countries in denuclearization and peace building in North Korea. You've assembled a list of leading lights in the academic community with an interest in the peninsula. This year has been particularly challenging for people who study North Korea and for people who work there. In our case, restrictions put in place to handle COVID-19 have resulted in the temporary closure of the British Embassy in Pyongyang. But we're looking forward to reopening the embassy there as soon as we can. Our embassies provide a vital link to the authorities in Pyongyang and a window into what's happening on the ground. We don't know in detail what the pandemic has meant for the North Korean economy or for its weapons programs. What we do know is that the Kim regime has continued to show off new weaponry, notably at the recent parade celebrating the 75th anniversary of the Workers' Party of Korea, and we've seen a range of provocative statements and actions coming from the country this year. These developments are disappointing, but they've not changed our commitment to securing peace on the Korean Peninsula, nor to the dismantling of North Korea's nuclear and weapons programs. We'll continue to work with our European and international partners, including via the UN Security Council, to urge North Korea back to the negotiating table. As long as North Korea chooses not to abide by its international responsibilities, we'll continue to join the effort to enforce international sanctions. But the door is not closed. North Korea can still grasp the opportunity to achieve prosperity and success for its people. I continue to hope that by the time of this conference next year, we'll have seen some positive progress. Once again, I wish you all the best for the conference, and I look forward to hearing more about the conclusions of your discussions. Thank you.
Thank you for your participation. My name is Yong Choi, Deputy Minister for Unification Policy of the Ministry of Unification. The Ministry of Unification has been hosting Korea Global Forum for Peace for several years throughout the world to discuss issues concerning the Korean Peninsula. Although this year's webinar is held online, we are pleased to co-host this webinar with the SOAS University of London and the King's College London. I would like to extend my deepest appreciation to Dr. Felix Belanscotter, Head of Department of Politics and International Studies of the SOAS University, as well as Dr. Joanna Montgomery, Head of Department of European and International Studies at the King's College London. I would also like to thank 3 moderators and 12 experts who will be joining our webinar, as well as the ROK Ambassador to the United Kingdom, Pagana, for joining us, and the British Ambassador to the ROK, Simon Smith, for his message. We just had a US election. With a rapidly changing international environment, I would like to highlight that the ROK government will continue to work for the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula and improve inter-Korean relations. US DPRK joint communique of 2000 and the Singapore Summit of 2011 at 18 gave us a vision for denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula and the possibility of improving the US-DPRK relations. I have a belief that when two Koreas restart dialogue and build trust, we'll be able to create the environment where the international community can share fruits of the peace of the Korean Peninsula. I would like to request active role and cooperation by European countries to shape international environment to ensure that North Korea will take a cautious and wise action. Today, we'll be listening to Korean and European experts on denuclearization of North Korea and the role of Europe. And once again, I would like to extend my heartfelt appreciation for your interest in the Korean Peninsula. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're going to move on now to the first panel of this three-day session in which we're going to be discussing Korean Peninsula inter-Korean relations. And we're going to be focusing, of course, today on one of the most important topics in the Korean Peninsula, which is DPRK's denuclearization. And we're going to focus on the role of Europe. My name is Ramon Pacheco Pardo. I am a reader in international relations at King's College London. I also hold the Korea chair at the Free University of Brussels. And today with me, I have four distinguished speakers who are going to start by giving introductory remarks, each of them, and then we're going to move on to a Q&A session. So without any further ado, I'm going to introduce my first speaker that we have for this panel today, who is Michael Reiterer, Professor Michael Reiterer, who recently retired as ambassador of the European Union to the Republic of Korea, where he served for 3 years. Currently, he's a distinguished professor for international security and diplomacy and the Institute for European Studies at the Free University of Brussels. And during his career as a diplomat, he also served as EU ambassador to Switzerland and Liechtenstein, and he served in different positions, helping to strengthen the relationship between the European Union and Asian countries, in particular South Korea and Japan. Professor Reiterer, Ambassador Reiterer, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. Always a pleasure to virtually go back also to Korea and to all the others who are part of that international conference. Well, I will address why should the European Union engage at the Korean Peninsula at all? And before doing that, in looking at 5 different scenarios, perhaps let me give the main reason. I think the interest of the European Union has to be based on the indivisibility of security, and it is necessary for a global player to engage in one of the potentially dangerous spots in Asia. The Korean Peninsula is also at the conjuncture where major powers, China, US, Russia, Japan, Korea, have a common space, and they have very different concepts, values, and interests. So the EU interest has to be to maintain peace, avoid military action, and also very important, avoid proliferation. Therefore, there is a need for the European Union to engage, but it needs encouragement from the parties to the conflict, and at the same time, it has to do its homework to get all the member states and all the EU institutions on board to foster and back up politically this engagement. I think the new term used is Team Europe. Everybody should go into one direction. Well, we find that in the 2016 global strategy of the European Union, where this common security interest is clearly put down, And in 2018, the enhanced EU security cooperation in and with Asia was formulated with a specific interest and engagement with Korea. And also important in the context, I would say, the 2019 connectivity strategy. I heard, and when I'm reading all kinds of analysis, very often I hear, well, once there's an implementation of an agreement, the European Union could play a role. Yes, but in order to get to an agreement to be implemented, that might be a long and windy road. And I think there is no point in saying from the outset, well, that's not for the European Union, you have to come in later. I think what we need is trust and confidence building, and that's part of crisis management, to which the European Union has subscribed as a main foreign policy issue. And we have to make sure that this communication between the main partners involved, North Korea, South Korea, and the US, is maintained, because what we have experienced, that even after summits labeled successful, communication has come to a standstill. We have to deal at the same time with a situation where North Korea, either the regime, the Workers' Party, or the representative, the leaders, say denuclearization is not really an option because it is necessary to guarantee the security of the people of North Korea, speak the regime of the Kim dynasty, and also because it's part of the constitution. Well, I think this is a lesser problem in North Korea. But then I think the shrewd politician, Kim Jong-un, tactically always says, well, there's a possibility for denuclearization if certain conditions are met. And I think he has pokered in the last time very successfully that those conditions, unfortunately, are never met. And therefore he can continue. And this has also been the recipe of his friendship with President Trump, which allowed him to continue with the development of missiles over the last 2 years. So where is the added value of the European Union? I think this is something which we have to ask ourselves, and also have to convince our partners, because sometimes I also hear, why should we get the complicated partner, multilateral and so on board? That might render things more complicated. Well, I think what the European Union could add is stability, predictability, reliability, and if need, diplomatic back channels. And these are all issues which are in rather short supply in Northeast Asia. Now, let me come quickly to these 5 scenarios. Five scenarios in the development or in solving the crisis, I think, where the European Union can play a role in each of them or in part of them, being, I would admit, a secondary player. You have also the luxury to select in which process and which part of the process you want to engage. So I will talk briefly about trust building measures, about the negotiating process, the implementation of a deal, the development of the Korean Peninsula, and the breakdown of talks. First, trust building measures. Well, I think reopening of lines of communication as part of the critical engagement is something which the European Union will have to do, while continuing the application of the international sanction regime. In the process, it could be possible to reduce sanctions, autonomous sanction perhaps, if certain criteria are met, and a clear snap-back mechanism has to be developed, which then can be used immediately. Restarting the political dialogue can help. It could also be talking more about human rights. I think this is one of the strengths and perhaps the weakness of the European Union. But this is something which has been done. And a restart was very close in 2018, especially if you work with the UN rapporteur for the persons with disabilities, which had access. And if you look at human rights, also from the point of view of human security. Lines of communication would be easier if an EU ambassador is accredited to North Korea, like many member states who also have, 6 of them have embassies. And I think to be on the ground in the Team Europe spirit is, of course, a big advantage. It will also help, I think, to open up for people-to-people contact in order to make it easier for trust-building measures with some more students, with some vocational training, with some medical staff. I think these are all issues which could be considered. The same food security, which is already part of the work, but also reforestation, for example, paramedical training. These are all issues which could be part of confidence building measures. And if you really want to get engaged, I think at the end of the day, one will have to consider whether a special envoy who has actually time and the means to concentrate on that issue would be helpful in the other stages too. Negotiating process as number 2. Well, we have already talked often about the example of the negotiating technique of the Iran deal, multilateral setting, which could be an asset. And also, we have to make sure that, I would say, Europe is part of the process. And I'm saying Europe because also Switzerland is active, Norway is active, and denuclearization and non-proliferation is a global issue and not just a regional issue. One could provide a framework. We have seen the 6-party talks was not the best framework. We could try others, more of UN, more of OSCE, more EU, perhaps more combination of EU and ASEAN. I think there one has to be flexible and perhaps think outside the box. What has to be clear, and that's something which is a sort of mantra, one has to make clear that the European Union should not be invited to the table just as the paymaster. That's we had with Cato, and I think this is not something to be repeated. Now, if we come to a deal, to the implementation as the third one, well, then participation in the cost sharing, therefore I mentioned it, financially, but also through know-how and expertise might be useful. The dismantling process has to be funded. Also, taking back of nuclear material needs a certain know-how. Transport, and I think there some of our member states, and including the UK, are well placed to do so. One will have to think what to do with all the scientists who are working in North Korea on nuclear issues, on missiles issue. I think redirecting them and giving them a possibility to use their knowledge for peaceful means through retraining might be useful. Seeing is believing. We would need inspectors, and I think their European inspectors might be more in demand than American inspectors, but again, working with the International Atomic Agency would be useful. Fourth, if we are looking ahead, then I think in the development process, the European Union could draw on its experience after 1989, rebuilding of societies, rebuilding of public administrations, economic and financial structures, development programs, and also financing where the European Development Bank would also be well placed. What I have mentioned with training, retooling, all that would be part if we ever come to this development stage. There's also a functional cooperation, and there connectivity comes in. Transport, energy are probably two of the most important elements on the Korean Peninsula. And the fifth, which we hope we will not need if there's a complete breakdown of talks again, then offering back channel good services, making use of the convening power could be something the European Union could do. So that just shortly why we should engage and how we could engage in these 5 different scenarios, but we would have to do a sort of contingency planning with, and that's what I would underline, Team Europe approach and in cooperation with other partners. Thank you.
Thanks to you, Ambassador, for this excellent presentation. We're going to move on now to our second speaker, Professor Chun Bong-kun, who is a professor at the Department of Security and Unification Studies in the Korean National Diplomatic Academy at the Institute of Foreign Affairs and National Security within the Academy. In the past, Professor Jung held several government and non-governmental positions. He was a policy advisor to the Ministry of Unification. He was also secretary to the President for International Security Affairs at the Presidential Office, and he also worked in KIDO, the Korean Peninsula Energy Development Organization, in the New York headquarters. Professor Chun, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon and good morning. I'm very glad to attend today's virtual Korea Global Forum for Peace. So you hear me, right? And also to meet with old and new European friends. And I'm also very glad to see Ambassador Park is stay well and strong. Today I want to share my thoughts on one new and a very important factor occurring at the moment. That is the new Biden government, the Biden administration. What that factor could affect what's going to occurring on the Korean Peninsula. Since in the meantime, inter-Korean relations was one factor, but US DPRK was another factor that has significantly affected the course of action on the peninsula. Especially there was a very significant Trump factor. When Trump is gone and Biden is coming, what's going to happen? That is the issue that I want to say today. There is both challenge and opportunity factors. From the Korean perspective, I'm not representing the government, but sort of I try to see from the Korean governmental perspective. First, as Biden confirmed several times during the campaign, US will return to traditional American diplomacy. That's going to be some challenging factors. In that case, all negotiations should begin with the bottom-up working level 1. And only when all clouds are cleared and the substantive results are arranged, then summit could be held to seal the deal. That's going to be quite a tall order to ask for. But however, I can say here, a good news is that the summit barrier has been significantly lowered. In the past, US DPRK summit was unthinkable, but now it's becoming part of a precedent. And also, secondly, meeting with a rogue state, especially summit, is considered a reward by the Biden administration. He once claimed at the presidential debate, Trump's summit with North Korea legitimized the regime. And also, Trump eased the sanctions, though not a single bomb or missile was removed. And also, Biden once called Chairman Kim as a thug, showing his reluctance to engage with Kim. That's going to be somehow a difficult factor here. But I don't think that's really a serious obstruction here. And also, the more serious problem could be here is that Biden's high focus on domestic affairs. And they have very serious economic problems and domestic healing problems within for healing the division among them and or the sort of serious health problem. And also among foreign policy issues, those issues such as the JCPOA and the climate change, pandemic response, and nuclear disarmament are giving some high priority. But I didn't hear any serious thought about the DPRK nuclear problem. Somehow it is, because you could consider that it's somehow being under control so that we could that live to the lower of our laundry list. But in that case, I'm afraid that DPRK could be impatient. On the other hand, there are some opportunity factors that I think we should be utilizing fully. And here, this before this U.S. election in Korea, among North Korean observers, North Korean experts, there was some expectation that Trump could be preferable. But after election, immediately after election, I could see such a high rising expectation that Biden could be the one who would be really helping us to engage with the DPRK. I don't know, but I think there could be some truth there. And the ROK, a progressive government, seem to feel comfortable, very comfortable in talking to U.S. Democratic Party and the Biden about the North Korea policy, as both share a somewhat very similar approach toward DPRK. This ROK Korean government is finding that U.S. Democratic Party's policy, DPRK policy line could be mostly relying on diplomatic means, and that they clearly said that military means is out. And also, we have seen previously President Carter, who engaged in 1994 to defuse the world crisis. And also, we have seen President Clinton at his last year invited Jo Myung-no to the Washington White House. And then they had also 2000 US DPRK joint communique. That is considered one of the highest level somehow engagement, commitment from both sides. And in fact, President Clinton almost visited Pyongyang, unless there was not President Bush next time. And also, we could see Obama in his first day, he was claiming that I'm going to end a Cold War era, enemy relations with Cuba, Iran, and North Korea. And then he was succeeding in improving relations with Cuba and Iran, but he couldn't overcome opposition on his commitment to end hostile relations with DPRK. Probably Obama, or inheriting that kind of tradition, they are ready to engage in ending this Cold War relics. So in that sense, I think there is some hopeful background that there could be a serious engagement from the U.S. side. And but on the other hand, in Korea, we are seeing some, not a few Korean experts predicting that the U.S. might return to neglect policy or strategic patience policy toward the DPRK. But I really don't think so, in my view. There is a couple of reasons. During Obama period in South Korea, there was a Lee Myung-bak and the Park Geun-hye government, quite a conservative government. They were not liking, U.S. Try to improve relations with the DPRK. So, so Obama just stopped engaging with the DPRK. And also DPRK itself was in the era of power transition from Kim Jong-il to Kim Jong-un. there was no room. They didn't have any time to engage in a dialogue, with outsiders, while they are so afraid of a domestic fragile regime somehow being, destabilized. So there was no room for DPRK and even South Korea, US. So there was probably somehow natural conclusion was just leave it there, don't talk much. But nowadays, DPRK has nuclear weapons. It's becoming very serious national security threat to the US. It's becoming very serious international security threat to NPT regime. And it's becoming very serious security threat to US allies, South Korea and Japan. So somehow I think it cannot be neglected. It cannot be just put on shelf. So I think this strategic patience prediction could be somehow is not likely to happen. And also, lastly, I think this Biden team, foreign policy team, is a big fan of JCPOA, Iranian nuclear deal. And I heard that from, I think it's Ramon or someone said that the US is showing interest how they are utilizing lessons of JCPOA, Iranian nuclear negotiations. And here, some people argue that the sanction worked. Some people are saying the sanction is making DPRK to come to the table and to strike a deal. But in my analysis of Iranian nuclear deal, there is much more than that. I think, first of all, there was a very serious, persistent, and a long-standing EU's role in engaging decades-long engagement with Iran before US jumped in. So I think this emphasis here is that there was EU's particular role to establish gain some confidence and trust from Iran by a long engagement EU. And also, President Obama was engaging with the DPRK at a very high level. They talked with Iranian president, Iranian religious leaders. There was not an easy thing, but they know that we know that this kind of EU's role and very high level political engagement, the DPRK, all helped Iran to accept this deal. And then it's giving them some sustainability. So I think if they are looking at the Iranian nuclear deal, and also EU is helping US how you achieve that, probably they may come up with some valuable lessons that could be applied to the DPRK. I have just last a few words what the Korean government wish to send some message to the Biden government. When I saw South Koreans, there is really a big concern that during this U.S. power transition era, or when there is a new dialogue partner from the U.S., DPRK tend to provoke or try to use some brinkmanship. First, probably they want to tame a new dialogue partner. They did that tactic against our President Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun. So whenever they are encountering some new dialogue partner, they just want to stand tall. So they just have some brinkmanship. And also, during the last a few years, the DPRK didn't have a nuclear or missile test. There may be some military technical needs for the testing. And also, during the last few years, DPRK had fired short-range missiles. There is a clear violation of UN Security Council resolutions. But Trump just overlooked that and just disregarded that. But if DPRK does it again, they have some just casually shoot a short-range missile. I think that's going to bring in a UN Security Council resolutions, then all of a sudden things could go wrong. So what you want, want to tell to the Biden government could be that we want Biden government to engage with the DPRK at the very early stage. I think there are plenty of experts in the U.S. and a lot of diplomats who have very strong experiences in dealing with the DPRK. So I don't think they need longer policy review time. So so if they are, for example, if DPRK, if the Biden government give a message to the DPRK that, okay, first they are taking note of that DPRK is a testing moratorium, give them some credit to them. And secondly, they are ready to honor a 2018 Singapore summit, the joint statement. And then thirdly, they will be prepared soon to hold a working level meeting to negotiate with the DPRK for the implementation of a Singapore joint statement. That kind of early message from the US side could help somehow make this transition period somewhat smooth and more stable. I better stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much to you for another excellent presentation. We now move on to our third speaker in this session, Dr. John Nilsson Bright, who is a senior research fellow at Chatham House, and he's also a senior lecturer at Cambridge University. As you probably know, he used to lead the Chatham House Asia program from 2014 to 2016, and currently he's running a Korea Foundation Korea Fellowship that is focusing on Korean Peninsula security issues, Europe-Korea relations, and the foreign policy and domestic affairs of South Korea. Dr. Nilsson Bright, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ramon, for that kind introduction. And let me again, along with my colleagues, thank the Ministry of Unification and support from the Korean Embassy in the UK and the support in general for the activity that we have carried out, all of us in the United Kingdom especially, and across Europe in trying to develop our interest in Korea. The support we've had from the Korea Foundation and other institutions in South Korea has made these sorts of events possible. And I want to underline the importance of that level of collaboration, both in terms of raising awareness of Korean Peninsula issues, but also opening the door for these sorts of discussions about practical ways in which European countries and the United Kingdom can collaborate to promote peace on the Korean Peninsula. I thought I'd, in the brief time I have, set out my thoughts about the role of Europe and the United Kingdom, but begin perhaps with an assessment of the deadlock that we face on the Korean Peninsula, because ever since Hanoi, of course, and the abortive summit between President Trump and Chairman Kim, the prognosis has been a very pessimistic one. That's partly, of course, a result of the misalignment of expectations in the lead up to the summit, with the United States, of course, under President Trump focusing on CVID and a full denuclearization initiative, and with North Korea pushing for sanctions relief. That gap in expectations and the failure of the summit has led to a great deal of pessimism. Part of that, of course, has been the dominance of the electoral process in the United States, fortunately now coming to an end, despite the efforts by the White House to contest the election on the basis of very dubious claims of fraud, but also, of course, made difficult by the fact that in North Korea, Chairman Kim has continued to develop his nuclear program. There is evidence based on the work of American think tanks that reprocessing continues. The Byungjin line, the focus on both strategic development and economic progress continues. And of course, we've seen from Pyongyang very mixed messages to South Korea, raising real concerns about the appetite in North Korea for serious discussions about reaching agreement on the nuclear issue. Professor Jun's points about the Biden administration, I think, are very well made. And I broadly endorse the idea that it's a mistake to argue that strategic patience 2.0 is going to be the order of business for the new administration. But it is perhaps also worth our thinking about the possible individuals who will staff the new offices of state in a Biden administration. There has been talk, for example, that Tony Blinken is a likely candidate for the National Security Advisor. And certainly his past comments on the North Korean issue suggest a fairly tough line on the issue of maintaining sanctions and the importance of focusing on the nuclear issue. Other individuals who may be adopt a similarly hardline position. Chris Coons is being talked about as a possible potential Secretary of State, Michel Flournoy as a possible Defense Secretary. These represent, again, I think, both challenges and opportunities, given that these are experienced individuals who I don't think are likely to minimize the security challenge of North Korea, but also because of their experience are perhaps well placed to think about more imaginative solutions. If one thinks of a possible new Defense Secretary in the form of Michel Flournoy, who has considerable experience in dealing with China and at least appreciates the importance of the China dimension, obviously hugely important in thinking about any negotiated agreement with North Korea. And of course, the man in the White House, or the man soon to be in the White House, Joe Biden, 47 years of experience, former chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and of course, in his considerable experience as vice president, a tremendous level of experience in terms of personal connections with many of the leaders who will be involved in the sort of discussion that we anticipate in the future. And all of this, of course, is happening in a context where President Moon, through his recent personnel appointments, has signaled his continuing willingness to focus on the importance in the brief time that is left to him as president to reach out and reach an accommodation with North Korea that doesn't minimize the challenge of the North Korean security threat. We see that, of course, in the 5.5% increase in defense expenditure on the part of the South Korean administration. And I think it's worthwhile emphasizing the combination of pragmatism and the appetite for engagement with the North that is, I think, a signature feature of the South Korean administration. And I think that's very important in underlining the importance of critical engagement, whether that's coming from the United States or European partners, a measure of both realism and a recognition of the importance of those important diplomatic channels. I'd also emphasize, along with Professor Jung, the importance of seeing both the challenges and opportunities that exist at present. North Korea's immediate challenges, I think, present a number of real opportunities for European actors in thinking about ways in which to move forward in the immediate future. Those challenges are, of course, a function of COVID-19. The closure of the border between China and North Korea has had a very real impact domestically in terms of North Korea's ability to gain access to foreign currency, reports of inflation in North Korea, panic buying on the part of many North Koreans, the scarcity of raw materials that has had an impact on state industries in North Korea. And of course, we know that the sanctions regime, maintained both unilaterally and bilaterally, has had a real impact on the living conditions of ordinary North Koreans. And particularly those North Koreans living in Pyongyang, an emerging, if you like, middle class in North Korea that have rising demands that will put increasing pressure on the Kim regime to demonstrate progress in the economic sphere. COVID-19 more broadly, of course, is a health crisis. And while the very positive language that the North Korean government has used to support its COVID-19 campaign suggests a minimal level of infection, we should be skeptical about the extent to which those reports are in fact accurate. A recent report by Johns Hopkins University highlighted the fact that North Korea ranks 193 out of 195 countries in terms of its ability to meet the health concerns of its own people, which I think underlines the gravity of the health situation in the North. And if that weren't enough, of course, the experience of recent floods has exposed more and more North Koreans to the challenge of poverty and maintaining access to those basic necessities of life. So for the Europeans, what can be done? Well, Michael, of course, has set out very eloquently some of the opportunities that the European Union can seize. I would emphasize the importance, again, in thinking about engagement, of still maintaining an effective sanctions regime as a means of incentivizing Chairman Kim to return to the negotiation table. and also underlining publicly and privately the importance of South Korea maintaining its security readiness, which we've seen, of course, in that commitment to increased defense expenditure. In this context, European countries, such as the United Kingdom, for example, play an important role. Britain has, through cooperation with countries in Northeast Asia, including Japan, demonstrated its willingness to present a very active and vigorous maritime presence in Northeast Asia, an important way of signaling to North Korea its ability to deal with the proliferation challenge that the North represents. And of course, through the British role on the UN Security Council, Britain remains an active supporter of the international sanctions regime, as Ambassador Smith, I think, was outlining in his own remarks. In all of this, of course, pragmatic cooperation is hugely important, not only between the United States and South Korea, but also between the United States and its other alliance partner, Japan. And in this context, I think one other area that's important to emphasize is the importance of enhanced alliance cooperation more generally. And I think the Biden administration will be, given its experience and given its recognition of those alliance relationships, very well placed to send a signal both to Tokyo and Seoul of the importance of that level of coordination, which of course would have real benefits in dealing with the challenge of North Korea. Britain and other European partners can amplify that message, again, both publicly and privately. When it comes to the United Kingdom and South Korea, as Ambassador Park mentioned, I think, in her opening remarks, the level of cooperation is ongoing, and I think both countries recognize the importance of sustaining and enhancing that dialogue. It's striking, of course, that just in the last few days, President Moon and Prime Minister Johnson have had a phone conversation underlining the importance of bilateral cooperation. Britain, which will be the host of the G7 summit in 2021, has already extended, I understand, an invitation to President Moon to participate in those important deliberations. And South Korea can play an important role in those discussions, where, of course, the topic of North Korea and dealing with the proliferation challenge will inevitably be part of those deliberations. And for its part, South Korea has extended an invitation to Prime Minister Johnson to attend the Partnership for Green Growth Summit, which will take place next year also. So there are many important areas in which London and Seoul, I think, can cooperate. More broadly, of course, the question of humanitarian assistance, given the importance of those fundamental structural challenges that the North is facing at the moment, provides an important context in which European countries, including the United Kingdom, can cooperate. It's striking that Thomas Quintana, the UN Human Rights Rapporteur, has stressed, even in the context of maintaining sanctions, the importance of extending additional humanitarian assistance. And here I'd emphasize one area where I think North Korea's policy focus is worth unpacking. Since 2017, the DPRK has signaled its commitment to the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals that the international community has underlined its commitment to. This is part of its 5-year National Economic Plan, and some of the areas in which those SDGs offer opportunities for enhanced multilateral cooperation, such as combating hunger, clean water and sanitation, clean energy, sustainable cities, and responsible consumption and production, are very tangible areas in which one could think about ways in which Europeans and North Koreans could collaborate together, assuming, of course, that the North Korean government is serious about delivering on its promise to support those sustainable development goals. It was only just over a year ago in Vladivostok that North Korea participated in a conference designed to focus again on the SDGs. Skeptics might argue that this is being done for public consumption, but I think we should be at least open to the idea that this is an opportunity where there is room for enhanced cooperation. Lastly, let me say a few words, if I may, about the role of the United Kingdom. Joanna mentioned the importance of history, and I think this is an area where we should, this year, of course, commemorating the Korean War, 70 years on, remember the role that British servicemen played in that conflict. Over 1,000 British servicemen died in the defense of South Korea. And those important person-to-person links, I think, are a reminder of just how important the relationship with South Korea, and indeed with the entire Korea Peninsula, is for British servicemen, but also for the British government. Britain, of course, has played an important role both in making the argument for engagement with North Korea, dating back now to 2000 with the opening of diplomatic relations between our two countries, but also has sometimes played an important restraining role when other actors have been minded to develop a more, if you like, provocative approach for dealing with North Korea. It was a British Prime Minister, Clement Attlee, back in 1950, of course, who intervened at the height of the Korean War with advice to then President Harry Truman to emphasize the importance of restraint when General MacArthur was making very provocative arguments suggesting that nuclear weapons should be deployed in an effort to deal with the North Korean challenge. I think it's important to remember that behind the scenes diplomacy can often be very influential in exercising restraint as well as making the case for sustained engagement. And even in the context of North Korea-UK relations, a prominent critic of the North Korean administration, Tae Yong-ho, the former deputy ambassador in the North Korean embassy in the UK before his defection to South Korea, since his defection has said very publicly that the North Korean government has in the past taken very seriously its relationship with the United Kingdom. And for a critic of the administration of the North Korean government to highlight that importance, I think is a clear indication that those bilateral ties continue to remain important in a whole range of different areas. British parliamentarians, for example, David Alton, appear in the House of Lords, has been in the past very influential in pushing the human rights agenda. It doesn't receive a great deal of public attention, but the painstaking and long-term work by parliamentarians such as Lord Alton and others to continue to make the case for a greater focus on the human rights issue, I think is important. And Michael Reiter has signaled, for example, in his remarks, the importance of disability provisions in North Korea, an area where North Korea has made, I think, tangible progress. And people like David Alton and others have been, I think, quite instrumental in signaling their appreciation and public recognition of the work that North Korea has made in these important but underreported areas. This sort of cooperation, which can be extended, for example, into the academic space. My own university, the University of Cambridge, has played a role in people-to-people contact between students. The work of, for example, Cambridge seismologists who have had important technical collaboration with North Korean specialists in North Korea to deal with natural disasters. All of these areas represent tangible human links that I think can be developed and enhanced as we try to think of ways in which to incentivize North Korea to be much more involved in these sorts of partnerships. There's a lot more that we could say, but I recognize that my time is limited, so I'll leave those discussions for the Q&A session and stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Really good presentation as well. We're going to move on now to the last presentation before we have the Q&A. We have with us Dr. Kim China, who is a senior fellow at the Korea Institute for Defense Analysis, and she's also an adjunct professor at the Jung Graduate School of International Studies. At KIDA, she is the chief of the North Korean Military Study Division. And besides her role in think tanks, academia, she's also an advisor to the government. She's on the advisory committee for the Blue House National Security Office and the Policy Evaluation Committee of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And she also serves as a member of the advisory committee for the ROK US Combined Forces Command and the Ministry of Unification. Dr. Kim, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ramon. Thank you for inviting me to the first panel of the Korea Global Forum for Peace. It's so great to be part of a very interesting discussion that we have today. I do believe that we are at a critical moment, as many argue that North Korea tries to make some form of provocative actions whenever there is a transition of power in the US. Personally, I believe that a lot will depend on how North Korea sees the security environment and sufficiency of resources to mobilize, cost, and expected benefits of assertive actions and interactions among many key players in this region. Even though North Korea becomes really risk affectant, it'll I believe, subdivide actions to signal by sending out warning messages first, intentionally revealing some kind of preparations for SOBM test, for example. And eventually how we react to these kind of steps will really matter indeed in the future. Or it can choose maintaining the current status quo as it becomes risk averse, preparing for the another 5-year economic plan to be presented in January next year at the party conference. But what I can tell you is what seems to be a status quo may not really a status quo because of the following reason. First, it is assumed that North Korea can produce 3 or 4 kilogram plutonium and around 40 kilogram HEU every year from Yongbyon facility. And the amount of weapons grade nuclear material may vary depending on the scenario, on various scenarios. North Korea has produced HEU only in Yongbyon facility, where 2,000 centrifuges were found in 2010. And the Yongbyon facility was reportedly doubled in size, and we can project that North Korea may have over 400 kilogram HEU by now. There are also concerns about additional facilities active outside Yongbyon. Second, delivery system of North Korea's nuclear arsenal is as equally important as the warhead, because North Korea diversifies its delivery means not only for strategic purposes, but also for tactical purposes as well. The dual capability of the short and medium range ballistic missiles requires our due attention. There has been a series of ballistic missile production cycle, from testing to development and finally deployment of a new system. In general, it took approximately 4 years for North Korea to build a new weapon system such as Mustam family and Hwasong family, and now North Korea turned to focusing on upgrading solid fuel BMs or Buguksan family. We may continue to see more weapons testing for not only for political reasons, but also for technical reasons. There are also key concerns here. First, the current moratorium agreed between the US and North Korea actually does not cover research and development. Second, in order to mass produce new weapon system that North Korea displayed, especially at the military parade at the 75th anniversary of the foundation of the party, North Korea needs to continue strategic trade in order to get necessary materials from the outside. Indeed, counting controlled items under the sanctions regime tells us that the export control of controlled items that nonetheless were sold to North Korea had some mixed results. Some members of the EU have been North Korea's trade partners when it comes to strategic trade, but after the sanctions regime in place in 2006, the volume of export of controlled items to North Korea sharply decreased to almost none. The fact that volume of export of banned items or controlled items rather increased, not decreased, when the UN Security Council passed the sanctions resolutions on North Korea is indicative of the difficulties of consolidating global efforts to prevent nuclear and missile proliferation in the North. Although the strategic export in 2018 sharply decreased, we still have some concerns, because in 2018 alone, a large number of items very crucial for the development of North Korea's nuclear and missile program were sold to North Korea, not only from China, but also from other UN member states as well. The items that North Korea continues to acquire are those that North Korea does not export, but only import, perhaps due to the lack of resource, expertise, and many other reasons. Of course, North Korea may have many of those in reserve, considering the vast amount of controlled items that it could have acquired for the last several decades. In order to delay the speed of proliferation in the North, it is absolutely important to cut the ties between North Korea and others like EU and South Korea did in compliance to the sanctions regime. There are currently multiple platforms that the US and South Korea can utilize in order to strengthen the export control regime. And there are many ways to invite other UN member states to comply with these resolutions issued by the UN Security Council. At the international level, the EU and South Korea are working all together at all major non-proliferation regimes. For example, the EU and South Korea engage in very robust discussions on the MTCR's updated control list, seeking ways to control the transfer of sensitive technologies through emails, people-to-people exchanges, and other non-physical channels as well. And at the regional level, experts are not only track 1, but also track 2, having meeting to share best practices and develop policy recommendations on a regular basis through a group of government experts and intersessional meetings of regional forums, PSI, operational experts group, just to name a few. I think we should continue this kind of efforts to address proliferation concerns before, as you mentioned, the US finally review the past practices and re-engage with North Korea in the future. I'll stop here and look forward to further discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much as well for an excellent presentation too. We now have some 45 minutes in which we're going to engage in a discussion about the topic of denuclearization and the potential role of Europe. Professor Jung, I think I would like to begin with you. You have already touched on this in your presentation, but there is a new US president, and he has promised to pursue principled engagement or principled diplomacy with North Korea. What prospects do you think there are for the US and North Korea to reach an agreement on denuclearization?
I would say if they both parties lower their expectations, their price, I think there could be a first stage nuclear agreement. When I say first stage nuclear agreement, it contained first confirmation of their goals as it was in the Singapore summit joint agreement. There was 3 goals they want to achieve. Secondly, very rough conceptual roadmap to go from here up to their goals. And third, the first denuclearization measures, such as freeze of all missile and the nuclear test activities, and the shutdown of Yongbyon nuclear facility. And we may ask for plus other, highly enriched uranium facilities, but I don't know. And thirdly, regarding verification mechanism, at this early stage, I just want to ask for low-level, less intrusive verification mechanism. We may borrow some nuclear disarmament type of verification mechanism, somehow indirect, less intrusive. If we are asking for just like any NPT member safeguards requirement such as a full declaration and full access to the facilities and the sampling, that never worked. That never worked during the last 30 years. DPRK just walk away. There is nothing we can do when they just walk away. That's and instead, I hope that the U.S. declares that it's going to start diplomatic normalization dialogue process with the DPRK. And I don't think even if they start this diplomatic normalization dialogue, it's going to take about 10 years. I think it goes in parallel with the denuclearization process. And also, hopefully, both parties open their liaison office in their capitals. And also, U.S. should ease the sanctions somehow to North Korea. So humanitarian assistance and the initial, very early stage small-scale economic cooperation project with South Korea or Europe could be flow into the DPRK. And as I said, there will be very thorny issues such as a full declaration, intrusive verification, and the level of sanctions relief. But I hope that by this time we know we cannot really enforce the DPRK to stay on course. They could agree, any agreement, whatever you like. And then when storm is gone, they just walk away. That happened during the last 6, 7, 8 times. So I hope that, instead of asking too much, we couldn't get what DPRK could give away. Then also we couldn't give them only that small, instead of, asking too much. So it's a kind of action to action, or maybe the same price. So we could continue either. And then based on that very early stage, probably I hope that we could move to the next level. I want to emphasize again that there is a clear limit to what sanctions can do to the DPRK on this nation-state system and under this U.S.-China strategic competition. And also we are not thinking of a war option. If we have a war option, we can really push them hard. But if we are excluding war option, there is not much we can do when DPRK just say no. And also it's our also opportunity of fact that, as mentioned earlier several times, DPRK Kim Jong-un is very serious about the economic development. I think we can utilize that, and we can send President Trump as a special envoy for the one-side development or whatever. And also I think EU could help DPRK to really show a developmental plan instead of President Trump. I better stop here.
Thank you. Ambassador Reiter, on this theme of a new US president, President-elect Biden has promised to work with allies. So if we focus on North Korea denuclearization, and as you said, the European Union should play a role during the negotiation process, not only during the implementation process, what role do you think that the European Union could play in supporting the US as it will probably try to engage in a negotiation process with Pyongyang?
Well, I think it's, first of all, a good sign that Mr. Biden, during the campaign, was writing an op-ed about the Korean Peninsula. So he has shown publicly that this is on the agenda. If we recall, and we have seen that now sometimes on TV, the first probably last meeting between President-elect Trump and President Obama was focused very much on North Korea. I'm wondering if there is such a repetition with President Trump and President-elect Biden, whether they will also talk about North Korea in the same manner. But I think what is important that the signs coming from the future Biden administration is the interest to engage, and I think they understand better what an alliance actually is and what it stands for. So I think that's certainly hope, and I think the European message can be very much in line with the foreign policy message. Look back what has worked and what hasn't worked. And multilateralism, which I think a future Biden administration will understand better, and also it was referred to the JCPOA deal with Iran, the multilateral approach probably finds more open ears in the future United States administration, and there the European Union has know-how to offer. It's not if you look at it's not only Iran. If you look at other areas in the near abroad of Europe, Balkans, very complicated negotiations, different levels. But European Union also engaged in Venezuela, further apart, or in the past in Aceh. So it's not that we are completely Eurocentric. But if you want to be this international player, then you have to be present and fly the flag in hotspots. I think, as I said at the beginning of my presentation. Let me perhaps just add one element. Also, it is right now above my pay grade, but I would hope that the UK, as a non-member of the European Union, will be a very close partner in security defense issues. And I think that should be part and was thought to be part of the deal. Because of common interest between the European Union and the UK. So I think this is something which has to be underlined. And what we have seen lately in the Brexit talks, the change of the possible change, the future change of the US administration seems to have had a good impact on the UK position. So I would hope that this will be helpful too. And the last element, I think I like the concentration on the development goals. If we get North Korea engaged, I think that's a venue to pursue, because we have also seen this is an area where China has become a partner. So we have these three elements how we deal with China, but when it comes to fighting climate change, it is a partner, and the implications of climate change on North Korea are, with all the floodings and with the hurricanes, is quite obvious. So I think this is an area which I would also subscribe to. Thank you.
Thanks to you. I wanted to move on to carry on with this theme of the role of Europe. But Dr. Kim, I would like to look now at the South Korean side and the Moon government. What role do you think South Korea would like the European Union to play, as Seoul, Washington, and other parties seek to steer North Korea towards denuclearization?
Well, I think in the short term, well, the EU can use these diplomatic channels to invite North Koreans to discuss benefits of denuclearization and hear their needs that we should pay attention to. The the EU is obviously in a better position than South Korea in this regard. It'll be much easier for North Koreans to visit cities in Europe than Seoul, right? So at the same time, as I mentioned earlier, the EU-Korea cooperation is very important because the EU can play a role in countering the proliferation of WMD, leading discussion at non-proliferation regimes. And many EU's outreach activities are very valuable assets to help other states who are not really complying with the UN resolutions. So EU can use its broad network to reach out to academia and the industrial sector for sharing information and promoting export control mechanisms, and etc. Currently, the EU and South Korea operates partner-to-partner export control programs. I hope that there can be more opportunities like this to have public diplomacy activities together to engage meaningfully with target audiences and groups in other parts of the world. And in the long term, the EU can participate in the preparation of cooperative threat reduction programs like it did after the Cold War. Former members of the Soviet Union, like Belarus, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, received assistance from the West in order to eliminate strategic assets, strengthening proliferation prevention measures, and to convert WMD program into civilian programs. And global partnership, in particular, in which European countries participate, can be a very useful tool to ensure sustainable implementation of denuclearization of the North, if there is any arrangement reached between the US and the North Korea. So I think this is very important for denuclearization, not just because it is ideal, but because it is really needed in the long term. And well, I think providing, well, lots of things when there is a progress really made toward a denuclearization, we are not just talking about destruction of weapons, but we're talking about providing transportation, decontamination, facility security, re-education, training of North Koreans. All things can open an opportunity to other members of the international community to participate and cooperate with North Korea and others. And so I think, well, there is a huge chance for the European countries to well, actually prepare for this kind of plan in advance with the South Korean counterpart.
Thank you. I found fascinating, and I wanted to ask Dr. Nilsson right about this, that you mentioned the potential role of Europe if there is a deal. So Dr. Nilsson, let's assume for a moment that there is a deal with North Korea. North Korea agrees to take steps towards denuclearization. And of course, in Europe, we have nuclear powers such as the UK and France. What role do you think they could play in the implementation of such an agreement?
Thank you. Well, I suppose I'd make a general remark at this stage, which, if one thinks about the United Kingdom, Michael Reiter, I think, rightly sort of welcomed the opportunities for Britain to, a post-Brexit Britain, to collaborate in security initiatives. And I think that is very important. And in principle, the signals coming from London suggest that Britain has an appetite to do that. But of course, to some extent, that's undermined by the continuing political squabble over Brexit. And we've just seen the House of Lords decisively reject the Johnson administration's willingness to tear up the international rulebook because of its preoccupation with the question of the status of Ireland in any post-Brexit agreement. And I think that's a very worrying sign because it highlights perhaps the preoccupation of Prime Minister Johnson with domestic issues and a unique willingness to, if you like, tarnish Britain's reputation as a country committed to the rule of law. So there's an important question mark about Britain's willingness to engage, whether it has the capacity and political bandwidth to be fully involved in the sort of initiatives we're talking about. We've heard a lot of talk in recent years about global Britain. But there have been a number of skeptics, including Simon Fraser, the former permanent undersecretary at the Foreign Office, who just a year or so ago, in testimony to the House of Lords, questioned whether that statement about global Britain really has any substantive meaning. So I am a little hesitant to fully kind of embrace the idea that Britain can play a constructive role, given those political tensions. But if we took a more optimistic view, I think there are a number of areas where we could see Britain, Ramon, to answer your question, being involved practically in trying to reach, to implement or to support any nuclear deal that the North Koreans might sign up to. One reason I believe that to be true is that Parliament has taken a greater interest in the nuclear challenge. If one thinks back to 2017 and that first dramatic Kaesong long-range missile launch, the Foreign Affairs Committee of the House of Commons convened a number of meetings. It highlighted in its own report the strategic challenge that North Korea poses to the United Kingdom because of the enhanced range of those missiles. And I think there is a growing interest, appetite, concern on the part of British parliamentarians to address that issue. Having said that, I think I'm also concerned about the way in which sometimes our tabloid press oversimplifies and dramatizes the challenge of North Korea and presents North Korea in somewhat cartoon-like images. So I think there is something to be said for government officials, and of course the increasing community of experts who work on Korea in the United Kingdom to present a more nuanced image and to think more constructively about ways in which Britain might cooperate. And here again, I'd like to single out the support that we've, both in Europe and in the United Kingdom, that the Korea Foundation and other organizations have provided, because I think we're seeing the development of a more informed debate within Europe about the Korea challenge. And in that context, we haven't spoken a great deal about the Track 1.5 initiatives that European countries have been involved in. Britain can play, I think, more of a role in that. The lead has been taken, of course, by the Scandinavians. And I think there is perhaps more space for Britain to play a role in thinking about those sorts of Track 1.5 dialogues, especially because, of course, we have such a long history now, a full 2 decades of diplomatic ties between the UK and the DPRK. And there are many venues that could be used. Ditchley and other foundations might provide a context in which North Korean officials could be invited to participate in those substantive sort of discussions. And in that context, of course, there are powerful examples from similar initiatives and similar types of innovative institutional thinking. I think back to the work of former senators Sam Nunn and Richard Lugar in the type of constructive solutions for dealing with a post-Soviet Russia, retraining nuclear scientists, providing opportunities to repackage nuclear isotopes for medical use. Some of those initiatives, which are well established, could be reapplied in the context of talks with North Korea. And British scientists could perhaps be involved in providing some of their own expertise. And here, of course, my last point is President Moon's own call for multilateralism that we saw at the UN General Assembly meeting, and his talk of an important Northeast Asia cooperative initiative for infectious disease control. Now, this is framed at the moment in terms of South Korea working with other countries in Northeast Asia, Japan in particular. But perhaps there's an argument for saying that this initiative should be broadened to include European partners, including, for example, the United Kingdom, or for that matter, France, which are showing a particularly renewed interest in developing a more active role in the region. There is, of course, a compromise to be reached between broadening the membership and therefore diluting the initiative, but also bringing in more expertise. And whether that could in turn ultimately form a, if you like, a template for thinking about the SDGs that Michael mentioned in his remarks, again, is open to question. But I think there are many areas in which Britain can work with its European partners and demonstrate that it is still part of a unified European team when it comes to strategic issues.
Thank you. I want to continue with you because we have a question from the audience that I think speaks to your expertise. It is said that Biden has strong ties with Japan. And the question from the audience member is, what impact would this strong relationship between Biden and Japan could have on the peace process in the Korean Peninsula?
Well, I suppose here it's partly, the big question is really what the new Japanese Prime Minister Suga, hopes to achieve when it comes to dealing with North Korea. He signaled very early on his willingness, echoing the line of his predecessor, Prime Minister Abe, to meet with Kim Jong-un. And one might hope that the issue that has been a deadlock in thinking about some form of normalization of relations between Tokyo and Pyongyang, the question of Japanese abductees, might be politically less of an impediment to Mr. Suga than it is to Mr. Abe. And there has been even talk, kind of echoing what Professor Jung was saying about the use of special envoys, that Mr. Abe might himself be deployed as an envoy in making progress on that issue. That is very speculative, but I think the mood in Washington, and certainly within the Biden camp, is that Mr. Suga is a known quantity. As Chief Cabinet Secretary, of course, in the spring of 2019, he made a special visit to Washington, principally, at least according to the official public reports, to talk about North Korean issues. And I think that's a measure of his engagement with this question. But I think it's also worth keeping in mind that domestic opinion has been a big block in the past. Of course, normalization, if it were to go forward, would offer real incentives to North Korea, because it would have to involve some form of negotiated financial settlement, paralleling, of course, the agreement between South Korea and Japan, dating back from 1965. When then Prime Minister Koizumi visited Pyongyang in 2002 and then in 2004, the Pyongyang Declaration, which embodied or at least conceptualized the idea of some sort of financial deal, was talking in terms of a settlement anywhere between $5 and $10 billion. Small beer by the standards of international settlements, but from North Korea's point of view, given its small economy, a very big financial contribution. My understanding is that the North Koreans have been asking for a larger, increased amount of financial support if one were ever to get to that stage of serious negotiations. But I think it is instructive and encouraging that there is, I think, a sense of confidence amongst the Biden team that Mr. Suga is a reliable partner. And I suspect also a degree of relief in Tokyo that we now have an administration, or we hope to have an administration next year, which will take the alliance seriously. While Donald Trump, of course, was a subject of much focused attention by the Abe administration, and we remember, of course, that important photo opportunity between President-elect Trump and Prime Minister Abe. It's back in Trump Tower. It's an open question whether, in fact, the Japanese government, despite investing all of that personal and political capital in the bilateral relationship with Donald Trump, got very much from the relationship because Trump was so mercurial and transactional in his approach. I think a Biden-Suga collaborative initiative would yield better dividends and would be a return to a more normal bilateral relationship. The big elephant in the room, of course, is the question of South Korean-Japanese relations. What can an American administration do to enhance bilateral ties between its two important Northeast Asian allies? The burden of history is real, and the impact of public opinion, and dare I say it, the role of emotion in sometimes, I think, acting as a check on rational cooperation between these two important alliance partners. But the prospects so far, I think, are pretty good, and certainly a big improvement on what would have been a much more disruptive second-term Trump administration.
Thanks, Ambassador Reiter. I want to leave aside the outgoing Trump administration, and I want to go back to this idea of an agreement being signed, and the agreement including the word denuclearization. And what do you think the European Union could contribute to the implementation of any agreement that the Biden administration, incoming Biden administration, could sign with Pyongyang?
Well, perhaps let me just first make a comment on the Japan issue. I do remember a photo which is always very telling, with President Obama sitting, and to his right, President Park, and to his left, Prime Minister Abe. So a sort of convening power of the United States and underlining the alliance idea. I think this is something I would hope, because that would also strengthen the position in Northeast Asia. And I think their action might be necessary relatively quickly, because there are activities in South Korean ports, so seizing of Japanese assets. So if that is deteriorating further, I think that would also have impact negatively on the security and alliance situation in Northeast Asia. So I think this is something where attention should be paid to very quickly. And I understand that President Moon Jae-in is just about to have his first telephone conversation with President-elect Biden. And I think that might be a useful issue to discuss at an early stage. On your question, what could the European Union do if there is a deal? Well, I think I would come back to what I presented quickly in that scenario. I think the European Union has this experience of 1989 and onwards on how to assist countries in a transition. And I think this is something which is extremely important, because it's perhaps comparable that you need a transition of the economy, of the political system, of training. So I think there is considerable know-how, and it might also be an issue. I think Gina mentioned it, of convening power, where to meet, where to implement. When you remember, when we go back to Iran again, the brunt of the negotiations then took place in Vienna. So I'm not saying this as an Austrian, but I think it just shows it needs very often a venue which is acceptable to all, because it does not carry the suspicion that the host is on one side or the other. So I think that could be an important element, and also the others which I mentioned, and I agree with Gina. We will unfortunately not talk very quickly about destroying nuclear arms, but taking back material produced, a transport issue which I mentioned. So I think there are a lot of areas where once we have an agreement, the European Union would have the advantage of showing that it has already worked in the transition which we had from 1989 onwards, and for which, by the way, the European Union also got the Peace Nobel Prize in this transition period. So I think this is something to have in mind. But as I said at the outset, it's a long and windy road to talk about implementation of an agreement. First, I would like to see the agreement, and there we need all these trust and confidence building measures, where I do hope to link it back to the next administration, that the US will have a broader approach. But I would also hope that the Biden administration takes probably one lesson learned, that in order to get started with working level negotiations, it might be necessary to have an early summit meeting to demonstrate, especially to North Korean working level negotiators, that there is a relationship between Kim and Biden, in order to avoid that you start negotiating with somebody who is not able to move 1 centimeter, and we have seen that already in the past.
Thank you very much, Professor Chun. I want to stay in this positive tune of an agreement between North Korea and the US. If there's an agreement on denuclearization, obviously there's going to be an economic package on offer to Pyongyang. And you have worked in the South Korean government and also advised the South Korean government. What do you think Seoul would expect Europe to contribute to an economic package to support North Korea in exchange for taking steps towards denuclearization?
Okay, thank you for the question. I think Europe has a lot of role to play, but I just want to mention just a couple of points before I get to your point. I just want to share my very general observation of how this DPRK nuclear problem works. And I think all of us have observed over decades, but my own experience is talking to me like this two very generalization of the DPRK nuclear problem. One is that during the last 30 years of our talks with the DPRK, there was always some vicious cycle of nuclear negotiations. DPRK nuclear crisis, then move toward it accelerate negotiations and nuclear agreement, and then collapse of the agreements. There is one cycle. There was so far in my accounting 8 cycles, big and small crisis, big and small nuclear agreements. All of them are falling apart. So this gives us a kind of a serious trust deficit. We don't believe DPRK in that. Also, DPRK never believe us. I believe that the DPRK always, didn't comply, just broke the promises. But in my view, in our party, we also somehow delayed fulfilling our promises. Sometimes we just wait, we don't take actions. So it gives DPRK some impression that our side didn't follow promises. And so it's a kind of big deficit. Already the US was saying we can't buy a horse twice. But in my view, if force are on both parties, I think we should buy 3 times or 4 times. Otherwise, things are going badly. My second general observation was that DPRK nuclear capability doubles every 8 years continuously, meaning that it's always cheaper. Denuclearization costs cheaper today than tomorrow. If we wait 1, 2, 3 more years, probably we're going to end up paying more. So those are very 2 general trends that we have to keep in mind. In that sense, I would say that once there was a nuclear agreement, as Ramon mentioned, that could be highly fragile. So in that case, I think Europe can help us to stabilize the situation. As you know, South Korea, US, when there is a governmental changes, our foreign policies toward DPRK is fluctuating one extreme to another. Then agreement is broken. When there is 1994 agreed framework, when there is a Bush government, they throw them away. That happens. So, but however, I could see Europe was something like blessed water in a ship that stabilizes the ship. You could having more consistent relationship with the DPRK. But when I was a little bit disappointed these days. EU was the only countries who could invite DPRK persons to have some training and educational programs. But when DPRK have a nuclear missile tester, you stop doing that. Then what happened? Things are getting better. Always things are getting worse. So I think EU still, like South Korea, when there is something nuclear missile tester, we can't really, stay on course. We have to withdraw. But Europe, having more long, far-reaching perspective, you could have a more, sustain your engagement with DPRK and having some influence them or to see the world. And also in regarding this economic package, I think I probably, if that's happening on the Biden administration, I believe that the EU has a lot of free hand to engage with the DPRK. So you could provide technical, educational, health assistance, and also some infrastructure development, energy part. And also, I really hope that you invite the DPRK experts to your countries and let them see the world. And also, you have huge experiences of peacemaking, peace building, and confidence building measures all over the world. You can help North Korea and South Korea and Japan to do that. And also, all these denuclearization cases, South Africa, Libya, Ukraine, all those are occurring in Iran, those are occurring in your neighborhoods. So you can help them, help us and them to come to a certain agreement that there could be more of a moving toward a better situation. And also one of the big problem of DPRK's economic development in the development process, they have a big homework of using, global financial institutions like Asian Development Bank or World Bank, but they don't know how to get in there. And I think there is some barrier to get in there. But there could be some, some temporary, some membership so that there could be some transition period. I think in that case, EU could help them. If we are going to help them, DPRK could be suspicious. DPRK could be suspicious of U.S. intentions, South Korea intentions. Also, our plan is, as I said, very much it's not sustainable. So I think EU has a lot of role to play. I'm very much looking forward to see that.
And I think in Europe we're also looking forward to that. Absolutely. Dr. Kim, before I ask you to put yourself in the position of the South Korean government, now I'm asking you to put yourself in the difficult position to think as the North Korean government. If there is an agreement on denuclearization, what role do you think Pyongyang might be asking Europe to play throughout the implementation process?
Well, I'm one of those who expect that the next US government is likely to try a very pragmatic approach to North Korea, starting with working level discussions in consultation with allies and friends, and considering condition-based sanctions relief, as Vice President-elect Kamala Harris and other in the Biden camp already indicated. North Korea has been very much frustrated with the lack of progress in denuclearization. So it may want to see an opportunity to get out of the difficulties that it suffers due to the pandemic. That it may want to use communication channels that it has with European countries who are the allies and friends of the US in order to shape the discourse very much favorable to them, in order to shape its future once it decides denuclearization. And I also think North Koreans will also want better economic relations with the EU as well. Even though the UN sanctions were to be relieved, US unilateral sanctions will stay because US sanctions are imposed not only because of North Korea's development of WMD, but because of illegal trafficking, cyber threats, human rights violations, and so forth. So it will search for other advanced countries in the West to increase trade, to boost up its economy, because North Korea, under Kim Jong-un, really wants to modernize industry. And heavy reliance on China, that's, I think, not North Korea's best interest. So.
Thanks. I realize we are reaching the end of our session, but I have one last question that I wanted to ask you, Dr. Nilsson Bright. Experience tells us that at some point, North Korea or maybe even the US might decide that it wants to slow down implementation of any agreement that they might reach. They might even think about withdrawing from any agreement that they may sign. What role do you think Europe could play then when one of the two parties is thinking about defecting from the agreement that they might reach?
That's a really challenging question. I mean, I think, again, it brings me back to this importance of the rule of law and how important it is that agreements are honoured. And that's why Britain's position, I think, is problematic at the moment. Declaratory policy is hugely important in underlining the importance that agreements be honoured. But as Professor Jung pointed out, the history of North-South relations, and thinking back to the 1990s, is shaped by perceptions on both sides that good faith has not always been reflected in the way in which these agreements are actually carried out, and that domestic politics all too often intrudes. I think Europe should signal early on that any agreement needs to be as watertight as possible, and that there will be penalties if the North Koreans resile from any of those agreements. What those penalties would be, well, I suppose one mechanism is to withdraw some of that diplomatic support and diplomatic recognition that has been there in the past. But of course, that's a very blunt instrument. We know that the North Koreans have looked at their relationship with Europe and their physical presence in Europe as providing important benefits, both legal and of course illegal. But of course, it's a very one-sided and potentially short-term response. But I do think underlining the importance of those agreements is critical. I wonder, however, if I can say just one other thing to kind of amplify what's been said already, which I think is important, in terms of what the Europeans can do. And again, this could be something that would be withdrawn if there were violations. One is in terms of the implementation of any nuclear agreement, providing human capacity to ensure that, for example, inspections might be carried out effectively. If the North Koreans are distrustful of the IAEA, and if the IAEA has capacity constraints in terms of the ability to provide enough personnel to monitor an effective nuclear agreement, it's possibly the case that European actors could provide supplemental personnel. And secondly, on this important issue that Professor Jung rightly emphasized of human to person diplomacy and educational initiatives, it's true that some European countries, in the wake of North Korea's missile launches and its continuing reprocessing activity, suspended some of those agreements. But many European countries, in principle, allowed them to continue, including, for example, the United Kingdom, despite the official government position of maintaining those sanctions. The constraint in the past has been a simple one: resources, financial resources. Educational institutions are self-governing institutions for the most part, and have the opportunity to provide that sort of training. But what we've lacked in the past is a sustainable and sufficient level of financial support from foundations, from international organizations. So while we appreciate why governments have good reputational reasons in terms of signaling, in terms of consistency, to take a tough line towards North Korea, they are also, I think, privately happy to see these sorts of initiatives continue. But we need to find ways of securing sustainable support from international organizations. So I would make a case, a plea, if you like, in this context, to think imaginatively about ways in which resources can be secured from educational institutions and foundations to provide for long-term programs, not episodic short-term visits, and importantly, reciprocal programs that will allow not only North Korean students to study in Europe and acquire the technical expertise that can help them meet their commitment to the SDGs, but also to provide opportunities for professors, potentially even students, although that's a more problematic issue, to engage directly with North Koreans in North Korea. And that would, I think, establish a foundation for greater trust and cooperation.
Thank you for that very nice message. It's perfect to finish the discussion together, and I fully agree with you. To our audience, remember that we have 2 more sessions over the next 2 days. Tomorrow we will be discussing peace building on the Korean Peninsula, and on Friday we'll be discussing the role of Europe in this peace building process in the Korean Peninsula. Before we finish, I would like to thank our 4 speakers for an excellent panel, really enjoyable, a lot of food for thought. I also want to thank the audience for being with us. And also I want to thank, of course, the Ministry of Unification for asking King's and SOAS to host this forum, and also for the work that they have been doing over the years in promoting greater knowledge and greater discussion about inter-Korean relations and what's going on in North Korea. Thank you, everyone, and we hope to see you tomorrow during the next session.